Welcome back to the channel. Today is our Q&A from October 16th, 2020, and we talked a lot about jazz theory using different sounds on dominant chords. We talked about Darius Tarafenko and his great theory book. We talked a little bit about George Russell, and we talked about a lot more. So thanks for being here. Make sure you're subscribed if you're not already, and enjoy the Q&A. We'll see you in the next video. How do you experiment with different scales when improvising? Okay, so I guess there's two kind of answers to that question. One is kind of like a practical, like you're trying to use different colors on a dominant chord. Like, for example, you could use the altered scale or you could use a diminished scale. And they're very similar, but different. They have different colors. So what I would do in that case, if I'm experimenting with that specific thing, which I think is the most relevant thing to experiment with in terms of playing quote unquote functional harmony, is to say, okay, on every dominant chord, I'm going to play this scale. I'm going to use this scale. So first, you're going to have to identify what that is, what the color is that you're going to want to try to use, whether it's altered or diminished or whole tone or something else. And then you just kind of plug it in, plug and play, kind of go slow. You know, if it's a medium tune, go slow. 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, that kind of speed. Hello, Carl. Good to see you, man. So that's one way on like a tune, like picking it, plugging it in 100%, going slow, making sure you know how to use that dominant chord, that dominant resolution. You practice all the resolutions. So then you just go through and you just improvise in those bars. So no, not in the 2 bar or not in the 5 bar, but just on the 5 chord and play that thing, that sound that you want to work on and go 5, 1. Just play in those resolution moments, so that you're isolating it, because you're trying to get it into your ear is what you're ultimately trying to do, at least from my perspective. You're trying to get it into your ear so you can hear it and play it. So you're trying to externalize that sound and get used to it and be able to call it up as a memory and be like, oh yeah, that sound, that's what I want to hear. I want to hear altered. I want to hear diminished. I want to hear whatever, whole tone. And then so you do that. And then if what you meant was something else, like how do I use different sounds when improvising, or how do I use different scales and just try to like create that sound. An exercise that I like to do, and my students will verify and tell you that they maybe it's kind of it's hard, is to do all of the sounds, practice improvising with all of the sounds of a certain parent scale. So a parent scale is major, harmonic minor, harmonic major, melodic minor, whichever order you want to think of them. But there's those 4 parent scales, which are 7-note scales that involve whole steps and half steps, right? So in those parent scales, each one has 7 modes. So we are all familiar with like the modes of the major scale, and you can experiment. Okay, I'm going to play only major. So just play major, Ionian. Then you can play Dorian. Then you can play Phrygian. Then you can play Lydian. Then you can play Mixolydian, etc., etc. But the other 3 also have modes, right? They all have names, but the names is not super important. What's more important is being able to hear the sound. So I say, okay, we go to melodic minor usually after major. So what I'll do is just play like a fifth on the piano, and I'll say, okay, improvise something that sounds like the second mode of melodic minor. So that would be like a sus with a flat 9 is what that sound would be. And so what I'm saying is, like, if it says C7 sus flat 9, that's going to be B flat melodic minor. All right, so you'd play B flat melodic minor over that because it's the second mode, but you want to emphasize C, F, G, D flat, because those are the notes that are in that sound, in the arpeggio of that sound, right? So I would go to that, and then so we say, okay, do that with that, and say, okay, now I'll place the C again and say, okay, now play the 3rd mode melodic minor, play the 4th mode, play the 5th mode, but from the same root, from the shared root, because that gets you thinking about each sound as a separate sound. And I like to think about them as sounds, you know. It's really easy to just kind of get caught up in like the theory of it and whatever, and like, oh, I got to do this, and you play all the major, you think of like even just the major ones, and you play all the major modes in a row or something, like in an exercise, but you don't know what that sound is like. You don't know how to use the sound, and you don't know how to like make the sound. So how do you make it sound Dorian? How do you make it sound Phrygian? You got to practice improvising. Like, how do I make it sound like that? How do I get that Miles Davis on Sketches of Spain Phrygian sound? Like, you have to either transcribe or you have to experiment around and figure out, like, how do I define that on the trombone? I think is really important. So we do that. Think about different scales. There's all the 4 parent scales, and then there's all the symmetrical scales like whole tone, chromatic, and then modes of limited transposition. Of course, that's what Messiaen called them, like the diminished scale, the octatonic scale, which is the same. And then, there's all these augmented scales and all different kinds of things. You can look at Jamie Aebersold's scale glossary. I'm not a huge scale person. I think that's enough. That's enough scales for me. I want to think about sounds and tensions and music. I don't care about scales. Even though my students will say I ask them to play scales, like which you do, I don't care about scales. How is virtual music school going? Do you feel anything is differently taught? That's a good question. We're actually more or less in person, at least some of the time. We kind of have a hybrid situation at UNT where the students are coming in for lessons, and we do some ensembles in person. So, but getting back to Aditya's question, so things are rolling along okay. We're doing the best we can. We have some projects coming up finally, some recording projects that we're going to do with our ensembles, and we're getting ready for our Jazz Trombone Day, which is November 21st, kind of recording some things for that, getting ready for all of that. So everything is going well, but I can still answer your question about virtual teaching versus in-person teaching, because I've been doing a lot of virtual teaching, and the main thing that happens when you move from virtual or from in-person to virtual, in my opinion, in terms of the way that it might change in terms of the content or in terms of how you teach or how you learn, is that all of a sudden it becomes way more out of the teacher's hands when you do it virtually. When you're teaching virtually, when you're learning virtually, it's way more on the student to take advantage of the situation, to actually learn the things, to do the work, put in the time, put in the effort. We have less, there's less in-person connection in terms of like, hey man, you really need to like take this seriously, or like, hey, you need to work a little harder. That kind of stuff all disappears. It's much easier to work on the what than the how because of the internet connection. And so what do I mean? I mean, like, it's easier for me to say, okay, play through the modes of melodic minor and to check that off as a box than it is for me to say, man, play the melody of Body and Soul, but play it more expressively. Is it going to translate across the internet? It might not, right? So it kind of makes a weird transition in terms of like what you can talk about online versus what you can talk about in person. But it doesn't mean you can't work on it. It just means you need to take extra steps because the technology is there. Like if you use Clean Feed or use some different things to do the audio, you can get a really nice thing. But most people just go through Zoom and it's kind of crappy. And I mean, it works and you can kind of get the gist of it, but it's super compressed and everything. So it's tough, but it's really so much on the student to take advantage of the situation. So if you're a person that's very self-reliant, you can do it very super well. If you're a person that really needs your teacher to like get on you, it's not so good. It allows you to go a lot faster in certain kind of ways, especially in like a class environment. If you're learning like a theory class or something like that, like you can kind of go through the check boxes, but that playing with other people kind of struggles and, but I don't think the ideas of what the things are you need to learn really change, whether it's virtual or in person. The way around it has been, for me at least, if you record separately, like before the lesson, and then together we listen to a high quality recording, even if it's just on your phone. It has dynamics though, it's better than Zoom. So if I can listen to it and we can talk about it in real time on your lesson, that's another way, a really good way. Or it could be a video too. We could watch it together. You could upload it to YouTube and we can watch it together and like talk about what's going on in there. That's super effective. Or do both, like play it in the lesson and then watch the video together or listen to it together. It can be a pretty effective way to do that with your teacher. So if you're doing virtual lessons, you might suggest that maybe they want to actually work together on watching videos together and listening to audio together and stuff. So anyway, so it's easy to get focused on the what rather than the how. Any book recommendations for jazz theory? Opinion on George Russell? Well, my opinion on George Russell is that he wrote really interesting music, and I dug into it a little bit when I was in college at Eastman. George Russell's cool. He's not my favorite trombonist, but he writes really interesting music. Doesn't mean he's not a very interesting composer. He's coming out of that third stream thing, which is cool. JJ wrote some third stream stuff as well. But I don't have that much of an opinion on George Russell, really, other than he wrote some interesting music. Jazz theory books. Look, you can get as many books as you want, but you have to learn it yourself through experience. That's what I recommend. So if you can do this, if you can learn the modes of major, the triads and seventh chords in major, do the same for the other three parent scales, you're going to have a pretty good understanding of harmony. If you can spell all your chords up to the 13th diatonically, that's going to help you. And you'll see like where all those different chord symbols come from, whether they come from major, whether they come from melodic minor, harmonic major, any of those, the book, all tunes kind of work similarly, right? Like it's all about voice leading and functional harmony, or it's about modes and changing modes. There's not too many different ways of writing music. It's either shifting modes or it's totally atonal and the things are unrelated intentionally. So, there's a book called the Jazz Theory Book. I like my favorite theory book, which is kind of technical, super nerdy, but I like it a lot. Darius Tarafenko, who is a teacher of mine from Eastman, wrote one called, it's the only theory textbook he has. Darius is spelled Dariusz, Tarafenko, Terefenko. So his book on jazz theory is probably the most comprehensive. And one of the more interesting things that's in there is that there's a tune, what does he call it? Tune model. So that most tunes fit into like one of these 14 models of tunes, like AABA or blues or whatever. So that's super interesting. And he talks about a lot of things and relating it to set theory, and it's comprehensive. So if there's one book, I would go to that, but it's a little high level. So if you don't have like a basic music theory understanding, it might be a little difficult and a little above your head. But if you know about seventh chords and triads and substitutions and stuff and diminished, then his book is going to be right up your alley. I really think that the theory is the last thing you need to worry about. Yeah, sure. Spell the name again. Darius Tarafenko is the author. I don't know what it's called, but it's a jazz theory textbook. Dariusz Tarafenko, Terefenko. Darius Tarafenko is his name. I will go back on Facebook and add a link to it in the comments after we get off the chat here or off the stream. But yeah, that's the name of the book. That book is good. But the jazz theory thing is, if you learn piano, you're going to learn it kind of automatically by having to spell chords. The more piano you can learn, the better you're going to be at improvising on trombone. So I always have my students learn piano. I always have them playing tunes on piano, even if it's just really slow. It's about playing the harmony, about seeing the voice leading, about the flow of all the harmony, man. And I guess I'm just a harmony nerd. It's all Lucas Pino's fault. Go tell Lucas Pino that it's his fault. He won't know what this is about, but it'll be funny if you do that. One of the most important teachers that I ever had, 100%. He opened my eyes to a lot of things. He talks about the relationship between improvising and classical music and jazz music, and how you can kind of combine them together. And we used to improvise like sonata form, rondo, not rondo forms, but yeah, sonata form for sure, and fugues. We would try to write and improvise fugues, which was like super hard. But even just the process of like trying to conceptualize what that would be like is a really interesting learning experience. So it's worth it. Check out his book, even if it's $50 or whatever. It's a textbook, so it's going to cost what a textbook costs, but it's super interesting. When I was in school, he was putting this book together. So I have all the like handouts that he was putting together when he was putting the book together before it was a book. So that's what I have. I don't actually have the book, but that's got all the stuff we talked about in our class. about jazz theory. But and it's hard to relate Western theory and jazz because it's not European music. It's Black American music. It's not. It doesn't. Like there's different aspects to it that it's sort of like Bach, but not. It's like yeah, there's these relationships, but you don't really need to understand Western classical theory in order to understand jazz theory. 100% not true. Like Western classical theory. I'm gonna get in trouble now, but Western classical theory, in my opinion, overcomplicates things because like one thing that they get hung up on is the Tristan chord, right? If you've probably heard about that Tristan chord, but it's a half diminished chord. But there, sometimes people get caught up in like the spelling, which is interesting to think about, right? Like they're caught up in the spelling of something, meaning like what flats and sharps were written down versus like what it sounds like. Because when I'm writing music, I write it so that it's easy to read. I don't write it because it like accurately reflects the chord symbol if there's no chord symbol on the part. Like if I'm writing a big band chart, like it doesn't correlate all the time. Like if there's sharps, there's sharps, there's flats. But if it says D flat 7, it should be a C flat, not a B natural. But at the same time, it's more about how it sounds to me, ultimately. So if it's a half diminished chord, it's a half diminished chord. It doesn't really matter that it's spelled a different way. It's still like pizza is pizza, even if it has this topping or that topping. I don't know. Maybe that's a terrible analogy. But anyway, let's not go down this rabbit hole of jazz theory. But anyway, Darius Tarafenko, great book. I learned so much from him about that. But just seriously, like don't even get a book. Just go and investigate modes and scale and diatonic scale patterns up to the 13th in every parent scale in every key. Do it on trombone, do it on piano, and you're going to have a pretty darn good understanding of what theory is. And it's just all representing these different sounds. So that's all these chord symbols are, is representing sounds in a shorthand, so that you can read it quickly. That's all it is. So don't rely on that. Use your ears. Think about it as sounds and absorb the sounds. If you think about 7 times 4, that's only 28. 28 sounds. Yes, they're in 12 keys, but it's the same sound. But thanks for being here. Thanks for supporting our competition. Please send in if you're a trombonist. Can't wait to hear you. And yeah, we'll catch you all real soon. So stay in touch, okay?